I'm Elena, 29, standing awkwardly in the corner of the grand ballroom at Rosewood Manor while my sister Victoria publicly destroys me in front of 200 wedding guests. The crystal chandeliers cast an elegant glow over the reception, but all I can focus on is Victoria's voice carrying across the room as she holds court near the head table, her pristine white Vera Wang gown flowing around her like she's some kind of fairy tale princess. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Oh, Elena? She's here somewhere, Victoria says, with a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand, her voice dripping with condescension as she addresses a group of her college sorority sisters. Still single at almost 30, living in that tiny studio apartment downtown. Can you believe it? At her age, I already had my MBA and was engaged to Jonathan. She gestures toward her new husband, Jonathan Whitmore III, heir to the Whitmore real estate empire, who's currently charming a group of business associates by the champagne fountain. I take a sip of my sparkling water, the only drink I can afford at this overpriced venue, and try to blend into the ornate wallpaper. The ballroom is everything Victoria dreamed of for her perfect wedding. Towering white rose arrangements, a 12-piece orchestra, and enough luxury to feed a small country. Everything I could never provide for myself, according to her. Elena's always been the family disappointment, Victoria continues, her laugh tinkling like broken glass. Remember how she used to talk about becoming some big-shot lawyer? Well, that obviously didn't work out. Now she's just pushing papers at some government office in Millbrook, barely making ends meet from what Mom tells me. It's honestly embarrassing. Her sorority sister Ashley, the one with the Botox and the fake sympathy, nods knowingly. Oh, we all have that one family member, don't we? The one who just never quite figured it out? Exactly. Victoria's voice rises with excitement at finding such understanding. Like, I tried to help her. I really did. Jonathan even offered to get her an entry-level position at one of his father's companies, but she was too proud to accept it, said she had her own path or whatever. And look where that got her. Nowhere. I close my eyes briefly, remembering that conversation 3 years ago. Victoria had cornered me at Mom's birthday party, insisting that I needed to get realistic about my career prospects. When I'd tried to explain that I was pursuing opportunities in the judicial system, she'd rolled her eyes and said, "Elena, honey, you need to stop living in Fantasyland. Some people are meant to be leaders, and some people are meant to follow. There's no shame in knowing which one you are." The worst part wasn't her condescension, it was how everyone else nodded along, including our parents. The thing is, Victoria continues, warming to her favorite topic, Elena's always been jealous of me. When we were kids, she'd try to copy everything I did, but she never quite measured up, you know? I was student council president, she ran for treasurer and lost. I was homecoming queen, she wasn't even nominated. I got into Northwestern on a partial scholarship, she had to settle for state. What she doesn't mention is that I graduated summa cum laude while she barely scraped by with a C average. Or that my settlement for state was actually a full academic scholarship that she'd somehow convinced our parents was less impressive than her partial ride based on Daddy's alumni connections. And now look at us, Victoria gestures grandly around the opulent ballroom. I'm married to a wonderful man. We just bought that gorgeous house in Elmhurst Heights, and I'm starting my own interior design consultancy. Meanwhile, Elena's still... She pauses dramatically, searching for the right words. Well, still figuring herself out, I suppose. Jonathan approaches the group, sliding his arm around Victoria's waist, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being photographed. Ladies, I hope my beautiful wife isn't telling embarrassing stories about the Castellano family. Just bringing everyone up to speed on Elena, Victoria says, leaning into him adoringly. You remember Elena, don't you, my younger sister? Jonathan's eyes scan the room until they land on me, and I see the moment of recognition followed immediately by poorly concealed pity. Oh yes, Elena. How nice that she could make it today. The condescension in his voice is subtle but unmistakable. Victoria had clearly briefed him well on my status as the family failure. "We should probably go say hello," Victoria says, though her tone suggests it's the last thing she wants to do. I suppose it would be rude not to acknowledge her. As the group begins to move in my direction, I feel my stomach drop. This is exactly what I'd been dreading about coming to this wedding. But Mom had insisted, and missing Victoria's big day would have created even more family drama. Then the orchestra stops mid-song, and a distinguished voice calls out over the microphone at the front of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" The entire reception falls silent as Judge Patricia Kellerman, a family friend and Mom's college roommate, takes the stage. She's an imposing woman in her late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commands immediate respect. I've known Judge Kellerman since I was a child. She's always been like an aunt to me, but Victoria has never paid much attention to her since she's just Mom's old friend. "I apologize for interrupting this beautiful celebration," Judge Kellerman says, her voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet ballroom, "but I have a very special announcement to make, and the timing couldn't be more perfect." Victoria beams, clearly assuming this has something to do with her wedding. She straightens her dress and prepares to accept whatever congratulations are coming her way. "As many of you know, I've had the honor of serving on the judiciary for over 20 years, Judge Kellerman continues. "Today, I'm thrilled to announce that Governor Harrison has just approved the appointment of someone very special to our family, to the position of Superior Court Judge for Millbrook County." The room buzzes with polite interest. Victoria's smile grows wider, probably wondering how this connects to her perfect day. "Elena Castellano," Judge Kellerman's voice rings out clearly, "would you please join me up here?" The silence that follows is deafening. Victoria's face goes from radiant joy to pale shock in the span of 3 seconds. Her grip on Jonathan's arm tightens visibly as her eyes find me across the room, now frozen in place with every guest staring at me. "Elena," Judge Kellerman repeats warmly, "don't be shy. This is your moment." And that's when the full weight of what's happening hits Victoria like a freight train. Her loser sister, the one who pushes papers at some government office, is about to be sworn in as a Superior Court judge. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before I tell you how I went from being called a family disappointment to becoming the youngest Superior Court judge in Millbrook County's history, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Family dynamics can be so different across the world, right? If you've ever been the underestimated sibling at a family gathering, hit that like button right now. And if you've ever had a family member who thought they knew your worth better than you did, you're definitely going to want to subscribe to hear more stories about family karma and the sweet justice that sometimes follows when people judge too quickly. I know what you're thinking. How does someone go from being dismissed as a paper pusher to having a judge announce their appointment at their sister's wedding? Well, the story behind this moment is even more incredible than you might imagine. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why timing really is everything, and why the people who underestimate you the most are often the ones who know you the least. This journey involves years of secret achievements, family betrayals, and a twist that even I didn't see coming. So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let me take you back to where this whole incredible story began. Because what happened at Victoria's wedding was just the tip of the iceberg, and the real story of how we got to that moment will show you exactly why you should never let anyone else define your worth. Now let me tell you about the Castellano family dynamics that led to this unforgettable moment of justice. Victoria and I grew up in a sprawling colonial house on Maple Street in the affluent suburb of Cedarbrook, where our father, Dr. Michael Castellano, ran the most successful cardiology practice in the Tri-County area, and our mother, Catherine, managed the social calendar that came with being married to one of the town's most prominent physicians. From my earliest memories, Victoria was always the golden child, 3 years older, naturally charismatic, and blessed with the kind of effortless beauty that made adults stop and compliment our parents on their stunning daughter. She had our mother's emerald eyes and honey blonde hair that always seemed to catch the light perfectly, while I inherited Dad's darker features and what Mom diplomatically called a more serious disposition. When Victoria was 7 and I was 4, she won the Little Miss Cedarbrook pageant, a victory that launched what would become a lifelong pattern. The local newspaper ran a full-color photo of her in her tiny crown and sash, and for weeks afterward, strangers would recognize our family at the grocery store or church. "Oh, you're Little Miss Cedarbrook's parents," they'd exclaim, while I stood quietly beside them, invisible in Victoria's shadow. That same year, I taught myself to read using Victoria's discarded picture books. While she was at dance lessons or piano practice, activities Mom insisted were essential for a well-rounded young lady, I would curl up in the corner of our shared playroom, sounding out words and losing myself in stories. When I proudly read aloud from Charlotte's Web at the dinner table one evening, Dad patted my head absently and said, "That's nice, sweetheart," before turning to Victoria to discuss her upcoming recital. The pattern was established early. Victoria performed, I observed. Victoria sparkled, I studied. Our childhood was filled with moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later reveal themselves as the foundation of our relationship's fundamental imbalance. When I won the 3rd grade spelling bee, Victoria threw such a dramatic tantrum about missing her friend's birthday party to attend the ceremony that Mom decided we should leave early. "Elena will have other opportunities," she said, gathering her purse while I still held my small trophy. "Victoria's social development is just as important." When I was selected for the Gifted and Talented program in 5th grade, Victoria announced the same day that she'd been chosen as a junior bridesmaid in our cousin's wedding. Guess which news dominated the dinner conversation? The bridesmaid dress required 3 fittings, a special hairstylist, and 2 weeks of Mom's undivided attention. My accelerated coursework was mentioned once, briefly, before the conversation returned to whether Victoria should wear her hair up or down for the ceremony. The most telling incident happened when I was 12 and Victoria was 15. I'd been working for months on a science project about renewable energy, staying up late to perfect my presentation, and building a working model of a solar-powered water purification system. It was the kind of project that required genuine research, mathematical calculations, and innovative thinking, the kind of work that made me feel truly alive. The night before the science fair, Victoria had a crisis. Her boyfriend of 3 weeks, a varsity basketball player named Tyler Morrison, had apparently smiled at another girl in the hallway. Victoria was devastated, crying dramatically in her bedroom about how her life was ruined and how she'd never find love again. Mom spent the entire evening consoling her, making her favorite cookies, and calling other mothers to get the full story about Tyler's alleged betrayal. Meanwhile, I put the finishing touches on my project alone in the basement, carrying the model upstairs by myself and loading it into Dad's car the next morning, while Victoria slept in to, quote, recover from her emotional trauma. I won 1st place at the regional science fair. My project was selected to advance to the state competition, and the local newspaper wanted to do a feature story about the, quote, 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 from Cedarbrook. But the article never ran, because that same week, Victoria was crowned homecoming princess, and somehow her tiara took precedence over my trophy. "Elena's always been the smart one," Mom would tell her friends, as if intelligence were some sort of consolation prize for not being beautiful or popular. "She gets that from Michael's side of the family. Very analytical, very methodical." The way she said it made it sound like a character flaw rather than a strength. Dad, to his credit, occasionally tried to show interest in my academic achievements, but his understanding of my abilities was limited and often misguided. When I expressed interest in law during high school, he assumed I wanted to become a paralegal or maybe a court reporter. "Very stable careers," he'd say approvingly. "Good benefits, regular hours. Not glamorous like Victoria's interests, but steady work." Victoria's interests, by contrast, were always treated as potential career paths worthy of investment and encouragement. Her brief fascination with interior design led to expensive courses and professional consultations. Her phase of wanting to be a fashion journalist resulted in subscriptions to every major magazine and a summer internship at a boutique that Mom arranged through her social connections. When Victoria decided she wanted to study business, Dad immediately began talking about how she could eventually take over the administrative side of his medical practice. "She has such natural leadership qualities," he'd beam. "People just gravitate toward her." Meanwhile, my academic excellence was taken for granted. Perfect grades were expected, not celebrated. When I scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests, the response was, "Well, of course, that's just what Elena does." When Victoria brought home a B+ in algebra, it was cause for celebration and a shopping trip to reward her tremendous improvement. The summer before my senior year of high school, I spent 6 weeks at a prestigious law program for gifted students at the State University. It was an intensive program that covered constitutional law, legal writing, and mock trial procedures. I was one of only 20 students selected statewide, and the experience confirmed what I'd suspected for years. I had found my calling. When I returned home, eager to share what I'd learned and excited about my future plans, Victoria had news of her own. She'd been selected as a contestant in the Miss Teen Cedarbrook pageant. The timing of her announcement wasn't coincidental. It never was with Victoria. Within minutes of my walking through the front door, the conversation had shifted entirely to her upcoming competition. "Elena can tell us about her little law camp later," Mom said dismissively, already pulling out her calendar to schedule Victoria's pageant preparations. "Right now, we need to focus on what's really important." And that, in essence, was the story of our childhood. Victoria's moments were important, mine were just footnotes. The pattern that defined our relationship throughout high school and college became even more pronounced as the stakes grew higher. Victoria seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to sense when I was on the verge of a significant achievement, and she would invariably create a crisis that demanded everyone's immediate attention. When I was accepted to Hamilton University's prestigious pre-law program with a full academic scholarship, Victoria chose that exact weekend to announce her engagement to her college boyfriend, Brad Hennessy. The acceptance letter arrived on a Friday afternoon, and I was practically vibrating with excitement as I waited for our parents to come home from work. This was it. Validation of everything I'd worked toward, and a full ride to one of the most respected programs in the state. But as I heard Dad's car pull into the driveway, Victoria's phone rang. Within minutes, she was sobbing dramatically in the kitchen, explaining between gasps that Brad had proposed during their romantic weekend getaway to Lake Geneva. The engagement ring, a modest solitaire that Brad had saved for months to afford, was thrust under everyone's noses as Victoria recounted every detail of the proposal, from the sunset backdrop to the exact words Brad had used. My scholarship letter remained unopened on the counter for 3 hours, while Mom called every relative within a 50-mile radius to share Victoria's news. When I finally managed to announce my own achievement during dinner, Dad glanced up briefly from examining Victoria's ring and said, "That's wonderful, honey. Very practical choice." Then the conversation immediately returned to wedding planning timelines and venue options. The engagement lasted exactly 4 months. Victoria broke it off the week before I was scheduled to give the valedictorian speech at my high school graduation, claiming she'd realized Brad lacked ambition and wasn't growing at the same pace she was. The family drama surrounding her heartbreak consumed the entire week leading up to graduation, with Mom taking time off work to help Victoria process her emotions, and Dad making concerned phone calls to his brother about whether Victoria might benefit from counseling. I delivered my speech to a half-empty auditorium because Victoria had insisted she was too devastated to attend. and Mom stayed home to comfort her. Dad showed up but spent most of the ceremony on his phone, presumably dealing with some new aspect of Victoria's emotional crisis. College brought a temporary reprieve from Victoria's competitive nature, mainly because we attended different schools and lived in different cities. For 4 blissful years, I could excel without worrying about being overshadowed. I threw myself into my studies with the kind of passion that only comes from finally being free to pursue your interests without constantly looking over your shoulder. At Hamilton, I discovered I had a natural gift for constitutional law and legal research. My professors began mentoring me personally, recommending advanced courses, and encouraging me to consider judicial clerkships after graduation. During my junior year, Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, who had clerked for a Supreme Court justice, pulled me aside after class. "Elena, you have something special," she said, her expression serious. "The kind of analytical mind and ethical foundation that this profession desperately needs. Have you considered applying for the federal clerkship program?" I had been considering it, but I'd never mentioned it to anyone, least of all my family. Federal clerkships were incredibly competitive, reserved for the very top students from the most prestigious law schools. The idea that someone like me, someone from Cedar Brook, someone who wasn't naturally charismatic or politically connected, could be considered for such an opportunity seemed almost impossible. Meanwhile, Victoria was struggling through her business degree at a private college that cost 3 times what my scholarship was worth. She changed majors 4 times, from marketing to communications to hospitality management, finally settling on general business with a minor in art history. Her grades were mediocre at best, but she had developed what she called her personal brand through social media, posting carefully curated photos of her college lifestyle that made it appear far more glamorous than it actually was. During family visits, Victoria would regale everyone with stories about her internships at trendy boutiques and her networking events with influential business leaders. What she didn't mention was that most of these internships were unpaid positions that lasted only a few weeks, and the influential business leaders were often other students' parents who happened to own local businesses. The contrast between our college experiences became starkly apparent during our family's traditional Christmas Eve dinner during my senior year. I had just learned that I'd been accepted for a prestigious summer clerkship with the state appellate court, a position that typically went to graduate students who had already completed their first year of law school. It was an unprecedented opportunity that could open doors I'd never even dreamed of walking through. But as I prepared to share this news, Victoria launched into an elaborate story about her latest internship at a high-end event planning company in the city. According to her account, she was practically running the company single-handedly, coordinating million-dollar weddings and rubbing shoulders with celebrities. The reality, which I'd learned through a mutual acquaintance, was that she spent most of her time stuffing invitation envelopes and running errands for the actual planners. "Victoria has such natural event management skills," Mom gushed, completely absorbed in the fabricated tales of corporate success. "She could probably start her own company right after graduation." When I finally mentioned my clerkship, Dad nodded approvingly but immediately launched into concerns about whether judicial work would provide adequate financial security. "It's important to be practical, Elena. You can't eat prestige." Meanwhile, Victoria's fictional business empire was treated as a guaranteed path to wealth and success. The pattern extended beyond academic and professional achievements into every aspect of our lives. When I started dating David Reeves, a thoughtful philosophy major who shared my love of books and meaningful conversation, Victoria's assessment was swift and dismissive. "He seems nice, but kind of boring, don't you think?" Elena's always been attracted to the intellectual type, but that doesn't necessarily translate to real-world success. 3 weeks later, Victoria began dating Marcus Kane, a business major whose primary qualifications seemed to be his expensive car and his father's construction company. Marcus treated Victoria like an accessory and had the intellectual depth of a puddle, but he looked good in photos and drove a BMW. The family's enthusiastic approval of Marcus versus their lukewarm reception of David spoke volumes about their priorities. Even our choices in extracurricular activities became points of comparison. I spent my free time volunteering at the campus legal aid clinic, helping low-income families navigate housing disputes and custody issues. The work was meaningful but unglamorous, involving long hours reviewing paperwork and preparing documents that most people would never see or appreciate. Victoria, meanwhile, joined the university's social committee and spent her weekends organizing charity galas and fundraising events. Her activities generated plenty of photo opportunities and social media content, creating the impression of someone deeply involved in meaningful philanthropy. The reality was that Victoria's primary contribution to these events was her ability to look photogenic in evening wear, while other committee members handled the actual planning and execution. But perception, as I was learning, often mattered more than reality in the Castellano family hierarchy. Victoria's visible, shareable activities were consistently valued over my behind-the-scenes achievements, no matter how significant those achievements might be in the broader context of our future careers. By the time we both graduated, Victoria with her general business degree and mediocre grades, me with highest honors and acceptance to Hamilton's competitive law school program, the family narrative had solidified into something that bore little resemblance to our actual accomplishments, but perfectly reflected our parents' unconscious biases about what success looked like. The truth about Victoria's relentless need to overshadow me became painfully clear during a late-night conversation we had during my second year of law school. I was home for Thanksgiving break, exhausted from midterms and the grueling schedule of clerking at Judge Morrison's chambers while maintaining my 4.0 GPA. Victoria had been unusually quiet all evening, which was so unlike her that I actually began to worry something serious was wrong. I found her sitting on the back porch at nearly midnight, wrapped in one of Mom's old quilts and staring out at the bare November trees. She'd been drinking wine, something she rarely did alone, and when she looked up at me, her carefully maintained facade had completely cracked. "Can I ask you something, Elena?" she said, her voice smaller than I'd heard it since we were children. "Do you ever feel like you're performing your entire life?" The question caught me off guard. Victoria was the performer in our family, the one who thrived on attention and applause. I was the one who preferred to work quietly behind the scenes. "What do you mean?" I asked, settling into the chair beside her. Victoria was quiet for so long I thought she'd changed her mind about talking. Then she said, "I've been engaged 3 times, Elena, 3 times. And each time, right before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, I realized I had no idea who I actually was underneath all the performance." This was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, maybe ever. Victoria had indeed been engaged 3 times since college, first to Brad, then to a law student named Andrew, whom she met at a sorority mixer, and most recently to Christopher, a marketing executive she'd dated for barely 8 months before accepting his proposal. "I look at you," she continued, "and you just seem so sure about everything, about what you want, about who you are, about where you're going. You've never changed your mind about law school, never doubted your path, never seemed to need anyone else's approval to know you were making the right choices." I almost laughed, but something in her tone stopped me. "Victoria, I doubt myself constantly. I just don't broadcast it to everyone." "But you don't change who you are depending on who you're with," she said, and there was something almost envious in her voice. "With Brad, I was the devoted girlfriend who wanted nothing more than to be a young wife. With Andrew, I was the ambitious businesswoman who was going to conquer the corporate world. With Christopher, I was the sophisticated socialite who could navigate any dinner party or charity event." She paused, taking another sip of wine. "But I have no idea which one of those is actually me. Maybe none of them. Maybe all of them. I just know that every time I get close to actually committing to one version of myself, I panic and blow it up." This vulnerability was so unlike the Victoria I knew that I hardly knew how to respond. But as she continued talking, a much more complex picture began to emerge of the sister I thought I understood. "You know what the worst part is?" Victoria said, her voice getting stronger, more bitter. "Everyone always talks about how naturally charismatic I am, how I can charm anyone, how I have all these leadership qualities. But it's all fake, Elena, every bit of it. I figured out early that if I was louder, prettier, more dramatic than everyone else, people would pay attention to me. And once they were paying attention, I could become whatever they wanted me to be." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All those years of feeling overshadowed, of believing that Victoria effortlessly excelled at everything, while I had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. And it turned out her entire personality was an elaborate performance designed to mask her own insecurities. "But you," she continued, and now there was definitely resentment creeping into her voice, "you never had to perform, you just were. You were smart, you were principled, you were consistent. Mom and Dad might not have made a big fuss about your achievements, but they never doubted them either. They never looked at you and wondered if you were lying about who you were." "Victoria, that's not—" "Yes, it is," she interrupted, and suddenly the vulnerable moment was over, replaced by the familiar edge of competition. "You think I don't notice how they look at you? Like you're this solid, dependable person they can count on. Even when they're focusing on my drama, they know you're the one who actually has her life together. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to be the exciting daughter, when what your parents really want is the reliable one?" This conversation explained so much about our relationship dynamic. Victoria's need to create drama whenever I achieved something wasn't just competitiveness. It was desperation. She had built her entire identity around being the center of attention, but she was terrified that if she ever stopped performing, people would realize there was nothing substantial underneath. Meanwhile, my quiet achievements represented everything she secretly wished she could be: authentic, self-directed, and valuable for reasons that had nothing to do with external validation. The financial pressures that would later drive Victoria's most destructive behavior were already evident during this period, though I didn't recognize them at the time. Her expensive lifestyle, the designer clothes, the luxury apartment, the elaborate social events, was funded entirely by credit cards and loans. She had convinced herself that investing in her image was essential for her future success, but the reality was that she was drowning in debt while trying to maintain a facade of prosperity. Her relationship with Christopher was particularly telling in this regard. Christopher came from old money, and Victoria saw him as her ticket to the kind of financial security that would allow her to stop pretending to be successful and actually become successful. But Christopher's family was subtly but consistently dismissive of Victoria, treating her like an attractive accessory rather than a serious partner. I witnessed this firsthand during Christopher's family's annual Christmas party, an elaborate affair at their estate in the wealthy suburb of Thornfield. Victoria spent weeks preparing for this event, purchasing a designer dress she couldn't afford, and practicing conversations about art, wine, and classical music, subjects she had no genuine interest in, but that she thought would impress Christopher's cultured relatives. The evening was painful to watch. Victoria performed brilliantly, charming everyone with her carefully rehearsed knowledge and strategic compliments, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was working harder at that party than I worked during my most challenging law school exams, constantly monitoring her performance and adjusting her personality to match what each conversation partner seemed to expect. Meanwhile, Christopher's mother, Patricia Whitmore, yes, the same Whitmore family that Jonathan would later marry into, made subtle but cutting remarks about Victoria's background, her family's quaint suburban lifestyle, and her charming attempts to fit into their social circle. "Victoria is so enthusiastic about everything," Patricia said to me at one point, the word enthusiastic, delivered with the kind of condescension that only old money can perfect. "It's refreshing to meet someone so unguarded. The translation was clear. Victoria was trying too hard and everyone could see it. But rather than recognizing that Christopher's family would never fully accept her, Victoria interpreted their subtle rejections as challenges to overcome. She began spending even more money on clothes, taking etiquette classes, and subscribing to magazines about wine and art collecting. The debt continued to pile up, but Victoria convinced herself it was all an investment in securing her future with Christopher. When Christopher eventually broke up with her, citing different life goals and incompatible backgrounds, Victoria was devastated, but not for the reasons I expected. She wasn't heartbroken about losing love. She was panicked about losing her financial security plan. That's when Victoria's focus shifted to Jonathan Whitmore III, Christopher's cousin, who had just inherited a significant portion of the family real estate empire. The courtship was swift and strategic, with Victoria deploying every lesson she'd learned from her failed relationship with Christopher to successfully capture Jonathan's attention and proposal. But the financial pressure of maintaining her performance lifestyle while planning an expensive wedding was pushing Victoria to increasingly desperate measures, though I wouldn't understand the full extent of her situation until much later. The catalyst that would ultimately expose the true nature of our family dynamics came in the form of an opportunity that I never saw coming, an opportunity that would change everything, though I wouldn't understand its full significance until much later. It was a gray Tuesday morning in March during my final year of law school when Professor Hartwell called me into her office. I'd been working on my thesis about judicial reform and constitutional interpretation, a project that had consumed most of my free time for the past 8 months. Walking into her book-lined office, I expected another discussion about research methodology, or perhaps feedback on my latest chapter. Instead, Professor Hartwell closed the door behind me and gestured to the chair across from her desk with an expression I'd never seen before, something between excitement and solemnity. "Elena, what I'm about to tell you must remain completely confidential until the formal announcement is made," she began, her voice unusually serious. "Governor Harrison's office contacted me yesterday. They're looking for candidates for a very special appointment." My heart began racing, though I couldn't have explained why. Special appointments from the governor's office were the stuff of legal legend, the kinds of opportunities that launched careers and changed lives. The current Superior Court judge from Millbrook County, Judge Patricia Kellerman, is being elevated to the state appellate court, Professor Hartwell continued. It's an extraordinary promotion, and it leaves an opening that needs to be filled by someone exceptional, someone young, brilliant, and untainted by political obligations. The words seemed to hang in the air between us. I knew Judge Kellerman by reputation. She was considered one of the finest legal minds in the state, known for her fairness, her scholarly approach to complex cases, and her mentorship of young lawyers. The idea that I might somehow be connected to filling her position seemed surreal. Governor Harrison has been following the judicial reform recommendations that emerged from your thesis research, Professor Hartwell said, opening a folder on her desk. Your work on constitutional interpretation and fair sentencing guidelines has been circulating among legal scholars for months. Did you know that 3 federal judges have cited your research in recent opinions? I didn't know. I'd been so focused on completing my degree and preparing for the bar exam that I hadn't been tracking where my academic work was being referenced. The idea that sitting judges were actually using my research felt both thrilling and terrifying. The governor's selection committee has been reviewing candidates for the Superior Court position, and your name has been at the top of their list for weeks, Professor Hartwell continued. But there's a complication. The appointment process has been accelerated due to Judge Kellerman's early transition to the appellate court. They need to make a decision within the next month. A month. I was still 3 weeks away from taking the bar exam, the test that would determine whether I could even practice law, much less serve as a judge. The timeline seemed impossible. Professor, I haven't even been admitted to the bar yet, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. How can I be considered for a judicial appointment? The governor's office has been monitoring exceptional law students for early appointment opportunities, she explained. It's unprecedented, but not illegal. If you pass the bar exam, and everyone believes you will, the appointment could be finalized immediately afterward. You would become the youngest Superior Court judge in state history. The magnitude of what she was describing began to sink in. This wasn't just a job opportunity. It was the kind of appointment that defined careers and shaped lives. It was also the kind of opportunity that my family would never believe I was capable of achieving. "There's one more thing," Professor Hartwell said, her expression growing even more serious. "The selection process requires absolute discretion. The governor's office has had problems with leaks in the past, and they've specifically requested that all candidates keep their potential appointment completely confidential until the formal announcement is made." She handed me a thick manila envelope sealed with the official state seal. "These are the materials you'll need to review and complete. The interview process begins next week, and the final decision will be made within 10 days of the bar exam results." I took the envelope with hands that were visibly shaking. Inside, I could see official letterhead, legal documents, and what appeared to be a congratulatory letter from the governor himself. This was real. This was actually happening. "Elena," Professor Hartwell said, standing up and extending her hand, "I've been teaching law for 23 years, and I've never seen a student with your combination of analytical brilliance and ethical foundation. If anyone deserves this opportunity, it's you." Walking back to my apartment that afternoon, I felt like I was floating 6 inches above the sidewalk. The envelope in my backpack seemed to radiate possibility and terror in equal measure. This was everything I'd worked toward since childhood, the culmination of years of quiet dedication and careful preparation. But it was also a secret I couldn't share with anyone, including my family. That evening, I sat in my small studio apartment, staring at the official documents spread across my kitchen table. The appointment packet included a timeline of the selection process, background check requirements, and a preliminary oath of office that made the opportunity feel tangible and immediate. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, my family had dismissed my career aspirations as unrealistic daydreaming. Victoria had openly mocked my judicial ambitions, suggesting that I was setting myself up for disappointment by aiming too high. Even my parents, while supportive in theory, had consistently encouraged me to be practical about my expectations. Now I was potentially weeks away from achieving something that none of them thought was possible, and I couldn't tell any of them about it. The timing couldn't have been more complicated. Victoria's engagement to Jonathan had been announced just 2 months earlier, and the family's attention was completely focused on wedding planning. Every conversation revolved around venue selections, catering choices, and guest list negotiations. My parents were so absorbed in creating Victoria's perfect day that they barely noticed I was finishing law school, much less that I might be on the verge of a historic achievement. In some ways, the secrecy requirement was a blessing. It meant I could focus entirely on the appointment process without worrying about managing family expectations or dealing with Victoria's inevitable need to create competing drama. But it also meant that I was navigating the most important opportunity of my life completely alone. The interview process began the following Monday with a formal session at the State Capitol building. I took a personal day from my part-time job at the legal aid clinic, telling my supervisor that I had a family emergency that required my immediate attention. Technically, it wasn't entirely a lie. This appointment would certainly create a family emergency of sorts. The panel of interviewers included Governor Harrison himself, 2 current appellate court judges, and the state attorney general. For 2 hours, they questioned me about everything from constitutional law to judicial ethics, from my academic research to my vision for the future of the court system. When Governor Harrison asked me about my long-term goals, I found myself speaking with a passion and clarity that surprised even me. I believe the judiciary should be a place where justice is accessible to everyone, regardless of their background or resources, I said. My research has shown that fair and consistent application of the law requires judges who understand both legal precedent and human complexity. The governor nodded approvingly. Judge Kellerman said we should expect exceptional things from you. I see she was right. Walking out of that interview, I knew my life was about to change dramatically. I just had no idea how dramatically or how soon the secret I was keeping would collide with my family's assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The bar exam was scheduled for the last week of July. Victoria's wedding was planned for the second Saturday in August. If everything went according to the governor's timeline, the judicial appointment announcement would be made sometime between those two dates. The potential for conflict was enormous, but I was too focused on the opportunity itself to fully consider the implications. I had no way of knowing that Judge Kellerman, the woman whose position I was being considered to fill, was also a longtime family friend who would be attending Victoria's wedding as Mom's invited guest. The stage was being set for a collision that would expose years of family misconceptions and force everyone to confront the reality of who I actually was versus who they assumed me to be. The weeks following my judicial interview became a masterclass in managing competing realities. While I was secretly navigating the most important professional opportunity of my life, Victoria was spiraling into increasingly erratic behavior as her wedding date approached and her financial situation became more desperate. The first sign of trouble came when Victoria called me at 2 a.m. on a Thursday night, sobbing hysterically into the phone. I'd been studying for the bar exam, surrounded by constitutional law textbooks and practice tests, when her call jolted me out of my focused preparation. "Elena, I need your help," she gasped between sobs. "I made a terrible mistake with the wedding caterer, and now they're threatening to cancel everything unless I pay them an additional $15,000 by Friday." The story she told was convoluted and suspicious. According to Victoria, she had somehow misunderstood the catering contract and had been paying only a partial deposit for months. Now, 6 weeks before the wedding, the caterer was demanding the full balance plus penalty fees, or they would withdraw their services entirely. "Can you lend me the money?" Victoria pleaded. "I'll pay you back as soon as Jonathan and I get back from our honeymoon. His trust fund disbursement comes through in September, and we'll have plenty of money then." $15,000 was more money than I'd ever had in my bank account at one time. As a law student living on a combination of scholarships, part-time work, and careful budgeting, my entire savings account contained maybe $3,000 that I'd been setting aside for bar exam fees and the security deposit on a post-graduation apartment. "Victoria, I don't have that kind of money," I explained gently. "You know I'm still in school. Maybe you could talk to Mom and Dad or ask Jonathan's family for help." The response was immediate and vicious. "Of course you won't help me," Victoria snapped, her tears apparently drying up instantly. "You've always been jealous of my happiness, and now you're going to let my wedding be ruined because you're too selfish to help your own sister." "That's not fair, Victoria. I literally don't have $15,000. "You could get it if you wanted to," she continued, her voice growing more accusatory. "You could take out a student loan, or ask your precious professors for help, or do something other than sit there making excuses while my entire future falls apart." The conversation ended with Victoria hanging up on me, but it was just the beginning of a campaign of emotional manipulation that would consume the next several weeks. The next morning, I received a group text message that had been sent to our entire extended family, including aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends. The message, sent from Victoria's phone, read, "Hi everyone. Just wanted to let you know that Elena has decided not to help with some last-minute wedding expenses that came up unexpectedly. I understand that not everyone can be generous when family needs help, but I thought you should know in case anyone asks why she seems distant during the wedding festivities. Love you all." My phone immediately began buzzing with confused and concerned messages from relatives who had no context for Victoria's passive-aggressive announcement. Aunt Rebecca wanted to know what kind of expenses Victoria was talking about. Cousin Daniel offered his own financial help if I was struggling. Uncle Frank sent a lengthy message about the importance of family loyalty during major life events. The most painful message came from my mother. Elena, honey, I don't understand what's going on between you and Victoria, but this is her wedding. Can we please just try to keep the peace and work together as a family? I spent hours that day crafting careful responses, trying to explain that I simply didn't have the financial resources Victoria was requesting without revealing the specific amount or making Victoria look irresponsible. It was an impossible balance, and I knew that no matter what I said, I would be painted as the unreasonable sister who was creating drama during Victoria's special time. But Victoria wasn't finished. Over the next 2 weeks, she launched what could only be described as a systematic character assassination campaign designed to reframe the entire family narrative in her favor. At Dad's birthday dinner, Victoria made a point of publicly thanking Jonathan for, quote, stepping up to handle the wedding expenses that some family members couldn't contribute to. When I tried to quietly explain to Mom later that Victoria had asked for an unreasonable amount of money, Victoria overheard and burst into tears, claiming that I was attacking her and trying to, quote, ruin her relationship with Jonathan by making her look financially irresponsible. The manipulation extended to social media, where Victoria posted carefully crafted messages about learning who your real family is during important moments and being grateful for the people who actually support your dreams. The posts were vague enough to maintain plausible deniability, but specific enough that anyone who knew about our conflict would understand exactly who she was targeting. Meanwhile, I was dealing with the most intense academic and professional pressure of my life. The bar exam was approaching, and I was simultaneously trying to complete the background check requirements for my potential judicial appointment. The FBI investigation included interviews with former professors, employers, and character references, all of whom had to be carefully briefed about the confidential nature of the inquiry. The stress of maintaining this secret while being attacked by my own sister was becoming overwhelming. I found myself lying awake at night, worried that Victoria's campaign to paint me as selfish and unsupportive might somehow reach the wrong ears and damage my reputation with the governor's selection committee. My worst fears seemed to be materializing when I received a call from Professor Martinez, one of my law school references, asking about, quote, some concerning family situation that had come up during his background check interview. Elena, the FBI investigator asked me about your relationship with your family, and specifically about any recent conflicts or financial disputes, Professor Martinez said, his voice carefully neutral. I told them I wasn't aware of any issues, but I wanted to give you a heads up that the question came up. I felt my stomach drop. Somehow Victoria's drama was bleeding into my professional life at the worst possible moment. The situation escalated further when Victoria convinced our parents to host a, quote, pre-wedding family dinner, ostensibly to celebrate the upcoming nuptials, but actually designed to put maximum pressure on me to resolve our conflict on her terms. The dinner was held at our childhood home, with Victoria and Jonathan seated at the head of the table like royalty holding court. Victoria spent the evening regaling everyone with stories about wedding preparations, while making subtle digs about family members who, quote, hadn't been as supportive as expected during this stressful time. Jonathan has been so wonderful about handling all the financial details, Victoria gushed, squeezing his hand adoringly. I'm so lucky to have someone who understands that weddings require sacrifices from everyone, and who's willing to step up when others can't or won't. The message was clear, and it was directed squarely at me. Jonathan, for his part, seemed uncomfortable with Victoria's passive-aggressive performance, but he didn't intervene. Instead, he spent most of the evening checking his phone and making polite but distant conversation with our parents. After dinner, Mom cornered me in the kitchen while I was helping with dishes. Elena, I don't know what happened between you and Victoria, but this needs to stop, she said, her voice tight with frustration. This is supposed to be the happiest time in her life, and instead, she's constantly stressed about family conflicts. Whatever she asked you for, is it really worth damaging your relationship with your sister? The unfairness of being blamed for Victoria's manufactured drama was infuriating, but I couldn't defend myself without revealing information that would make the situation even worse. I was trapped between Victoria's manipulation and my commitment to maintaining confidentiality about the judicial appointment process. "Mom, I'm not trying to create problems," I said carefully. "I love Victoria, and I want her wedding to be perfect. But I can't help with something that's beyond my capabilities." "Everything is beyond your capabilities if you don't try," Mom replied, echoing the same dismissive attitude toward my limitations that had characterized my entire childhood. As I drove home that night, I realized that Victoria's campaign was working exactly as she had intended. She had successfully repositioned herself as the victim of my selfishness, rather than someone making unreasonable demands. The family dynamic that had always favored her dramatic needs over my quiet achievements was once again playing out in her favor. But what Victoria didn't know was that in less than 2 weeks, everything she thought she understood about my capabilities was about to be shattered in the most public way possible. What Victoria didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that while she was orchestrating her campaign to paint me as the selfish, unsuccessful sister, I was quietly achieving something that would have seemed impossible to them just months earlier. The bar exam results arrived on a Wednesday morning in late July, delivered via an official email that I opened with trembling hands in my tiny studio apartment. I had been checking my email obsessively for 3 days, knowing the results were due but dreading the possibility of failure. Everything, the judicial appointment, my entire future career, my sense of self-worth, hinged on those results. "Congratulations, Elena Castellano. You have successfully passed the state bar examination." I read the sentence 5 times before it sank in. I had not only passed, I had scored in the 95th percentile, placing me among the top performers in the entire state. The email went on to detail the next steps for admission to the bar, but I could barely focus on the procedural information. I was officially going to be a lawyer. More importantly, I was now eligible for the judicial appointment that had been waiting in the wings for the past 4 months. The call from Governor Harrison's office came less than 2 hours later. "Ms. Castellano, this is Rebecca Chen from the Governor's Appointments Office. Congratulations on your exceptional bar exam performance. Governor Harrison would like to meet with you tomorrow morning to discuss your judicial appointment." The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. at the governor's private office in the state capitol building. I spent the rest of the day in a surreal state of anticipation and terror, reviewing my research notes and trying on different outfits that might be appropriate for accepting the most important appointment of my life. The governor's office was even more impressive than I had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, historical portraits lining the walls, and an enormous mahogany desk that seemed to embody the weight of governmental authority. Governor Harrison stood up as I entered, extending his hand with a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. "Elena, congratulations on your bar results. Judge Kellerman wasn't exaggerating when she said you were exceptional." What followed was not the formal interview I had expected, but a conversation between colleagues. The governor spoke about his vision for judicial reform, his concerns about accessibility in the court system, and his belief that fresh perspectives were essential for meaningful change. "I've read your thesis 3 times, he said, pulling a bound copy from his desk drawer. "Your analysis of constitutional interpretation in cases involving economic inequality is exactly the kind of thinking we need on the bench. You understand that law isn't just about precedent, it's about justice." Then came the moment I had been dreaming about for months. "Elena, it would be my honor to appoint you as Superior Court Judge for Milbert County. You'll be the youngest person ever to hold this position, and I believe you'll be one of the finest." The formal paperwork took less than 30 minutes to complete. By 10:30 a.m., I was officially Judge-elect Elena Castellano, pending the public announcement that would be made at an appropriate ceremonial event. "There's one more thing," Governor Harrison said as I prepared to leave. Judge Kellerman mentioned that she has a personal connection to your family. She's suggested that we make the announcement at a gathering where your family will be present, so they can share in this momentous occasion. She mentioned something about a wedding? My heart stopped. Judge Kellerman knew about Victoria's wedding and wanted to announce my appointment there. The irony was so perfect it seemed scripted. The sister who had spent weeks undermining my character and questioning my capabilities would learn about my historic achievement at her own wedding reception. "Yes, my sister's wedding is this Saturday," I managed to say. "Judge Kellerman is a family friend." "Perfect," the governor said, making a note in his calendar. "We'll coordinate with Judge Kellerman to make the announcement during the reception. It will be a wonderful surprise for your family." Walking out of the state capitol building that morning, I felt like I was living in someone else's life. In the span of a few hours, I had gone from law school graduate to the youngest Superior Court judge in state history. The achievement was so surreal that I kept touching the appointment letter in my purse to convince myself it was real. But the most surreal part was the secrecy. For the next 3 days, I would have to continue pretending to be the struggling recent graduate that my family believed me to be, while knowing that I was about to become one of the most powerful judicial officers in the county. The contrast between my family's perception and my reality became even more stark during the wedding rehearsal dinner on Friday night. Victoria held court at the head table, surrounded by Jonathan's wealthy relatives and her sorority friends, while I sat at a table near the back with distant cousins and family friends who barely knew me. During her speech thanking everyone for their support, Victoria made another passive-aggressive reference to learning who your real family is during important life moments. The comment drew knowing looks from several relatives who had been following our supposed conflict, and I saw Jonathan's mother whisper something to the woman beside her while glancing in my direction. "Elena's going through a difficult transition period," I overheard my mother explaining to Jonathan's aunt during cocktail hour. "You know how it is with recent graduates. So much uncertainty about the future. She's been a bit overwhelmed lately." The patronizing tone was familiar, but it stung more than usual knowing what I would be announcing in less than 24 hours. My mother was literally describing me as overwhelmed and uncertain to strangers, while I was carrying the secret of a gubernatorial appointment in my purse. The most telling moment came when Jonathan's father, Robert Whitmore Sr., approached me during dinner. He was a distinguished man in his 70s who had built the family real estate empire from nothing and was known for his ability to assess people quickly and accurately. "Elena, Victoria tells me you're still figuring out your career path," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "What kind of work are you hoping to find?" The question was clearly a test. He wanted to see if I matched Victoria's description of me as directionless and struggling. Instead of the uncertain, rambling response he was probably expecting, I looked him directly in the eye and said, "I'm committed to public service, Mr. Whitmore. I believe the law should serve everyone equally, regardless of their circumstances." Something in my tone must have caught his attention, because his expression shifted from polite disinterest to genuine curiosity. "That's an admirable goal," he said slowly. "Public service can be a challenging but rewarding path." "I'm prepared for the challenges," I replied simply. Later I saw him speaking quietly with Jonathan, gesturing in my direction with what appeared to be a puzzled expression. Whatever Victoria had told the Whitmore family about me clearly didn't match the person he had just met. As the rehearsal dinner wound down and everyone began making their final preparations for the wedding day, I realized that in less than 18 hours, every assumption my family had made about my life and my capabilities would be shattered in the most public way possible. Victoria went to bed that night believing she was hours away from the perfect wedding that would cement her status as the successful sister. She had no idea she was about to experience the most shocking moment of her life, delivered by the sister she had spent years dismissing as a disappointment. The stage was set for a revelation that would change our family dynamic forever. The morning of Victoria's wedding dawned with the kind of perfect August weather that seemed designed for fairy tale celebrations. I woke up in my childhood bedroom at 6 a.m., my stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread that had nothing to do with typical wedding day nerves. Today was the day my family would learn the truth about who I really was. I had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and rehearsing different scenarios for how the announcement might unfold. Judge Kellerman had called me the previous evening to confirm the timing. She would make the announcement during the reception, after the dinner but before the dancing began, when all the guests would be seated and attentive. "I've been waiting for this moment for months, Elena," she had said, her voice warm with affection and pride. "Watching you grow from that serious little girl who always had her nose in a book to the brilliant legal mind you've become, it's been one of the great joys of my career. Your parents are going to be so proud." If only she knew how complicated that pride might be. The Castellano house was already buzzing with activity when I came downstairs. Mom was on the phone with the florist, resolving some last-minute crisis about the bridal bouquet, while Dad paced the kitchen in his undershirt and pajama pants, muttering about traffic patterns and parking logistics. "Elena, thank goodness you're up," Mom said, covering the phone with her hand. "Victoria needs someone to drive to the salon and pick up her emergency makeup kit. She forgot it yesterday, and she's having a complete breakdown about it." The emergency makeup kit turned out to be a small bag of backup cosmetics that Victoria's makeup artist had insisted she keep on hand in case of touch-up emergencies. It was hardly a crisis, but it gave me something to do with my nervous energy while the rest of the family focused on the elaborate choreography of getting Victoria ready for her big day. The bridal suite at Rosewood Manor was a scene of controlled chaos when I arrived with the makeup kit. Victoria sat in the center of the room like a queen holding court, surrounded by her bridesmaids, her makeup artist, her hairstylist, and a photographer who was documenting every moment of the preparation process. "Finally," Victoria said when she saw me, though her tone was more relieved than accusatory. I was starting to panic that something would go wrong with my makeup. She looked absolutely stunning, her blonde hair swept up in an elaborate updo with delicate crystal pins catching the light, her makeup flawless, her wedding dress fitting her like it had been painted on. This was Victoria in her element, the center of attention and loving every moment of it. "You look beautiful, Victoria," I said sincerely, and for a moment, the genuine warmth in my voice seemed to surprise her. "Thank you," she replied, and I caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in her expression before she turned back to the mirror for final touch-ups. The ceremony itself was everything Victoria had dreamed of. Elegant, romantic, and perfectly orchestrated. She walked down the aisle on Dad's arm like a vision in white silk and lace, her face radiant with happiness as she approached Jonathan at the altar. I sat in the third row with our extended family, watching my sister marry a man who would give her the financial security and social status she had always craved. Despite everything that had happened between us in recent weeks, I found myself genuinely happy for her in that moment. This was her dream coming true, and she deserved to enjoy it. The reception began with the traditional cocktail hour, followed by dinner and speeches. I had been seated at a table with our cousins and some family friends, safely away from the head table, where Victoria and Jonathan held court with their wedding party and immediate family. As the evening progressed, I found myself checking my watch obsessively. Judge Kellerman had told me she would make the announcement around 8:30 p.m., after the formal toasts, but before the band began playing for dancing. It was now 8:15, and I could see her across the room, chatting with my parents near the bar. The irony of the timing was not lost on me. Victoria had spent the entire day basking in the admiration and attention of 200 wedding guests, all of whom had come to celebrate her achievements and wish her well in her new life. In 15 minutes, that spotlight would shift in a way she never could have anticipated. At 8:25, Judge Kellerman excused herself from her conversation with my parents and walked toward the small stage where the band had been set up. She spoke briefly with the band leader, who nodded and handed her the microphone. My heart began pounding so hard, I was sure the people at my table could hear it. This was really happening. Victoria was deep in conversation with Jonathan's sister about their upcoming honeymoon to Italy, gesturing animatedly with her wine glass and laughing at something that had been said. She looked completely relaxed and happy, with no idea that her world was about to be turned upside down. The bandleader tapped his microphone to get everyone's attention, and the room gradually fell quiet as guests turned toward the stage. Victoria looked up from her conversation, probably assuming this was another toast, or perhaps an announcement about the dancing schedule. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Kellerman began, her clear, authoritative voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "I apologize for interrupting this beautiful celebration, but I have a very special announcement to make, and the timing couldn't be more perfect." Victoria smiled and settled back in her chair, clearly expecting to be the subject of whatever announcement was coming. After all, this was her wedding day. What else could be more important or newsworthy than her happiness? "As many of you know," Judge Kellerman continued, "I've had the honor of serving on the judiciary for over 20 years. Today I'm thrilled to share some extraordinary news about someone very special to the Castellano family." The room buzzed with polite interest. Victoria's smile grew wider, and she glanced around the room as if accepting congratulations for whatever honor was about to be bestowed upon her family. "This morning, Governor Harrison officially appointed someone from this very family to serve as Superior Court Judge for Millbrook County," Judge Kellerman announced, her voice growing stronger with excitement. "This person will be the youngest individual ever to hold this position, and I couldn't be more proud to call them my colleague and friend." Victoria's expression began to shift from confident anticipation to confused curiosity. She looked toward our parents' table, probably wondering if Dad had received some kind of professional recognition she hadn't heard about. "Elena Castellano," Judge Kellerman's voice rang out clearly across the suddenly silent ballroom, "would you please join me up here?" The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. Victoria's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, her eyes widening in shock as she processed what she had just heard. Jonathan's conversation with his groomsmen died mid-sentence. Our parents sat frozen at their table, staring at Judge Kellerman as if she had just announced that aliens had landed in the parking lot. Every single person in that ballroom, all 200 wedding guests, turned to look at me, the quiet sister who supposedly pushed papers at some government office and couldn't even help with wedding expenses. "Elena," Judge Kellerman repeated warmly, "don't be shy. This is your moment." As I stood up from my table and began walking toward the stage, I could see Victoria's face transform from confusion to shock to something approaching horror as the full magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. Her loser sister, the one she had spent weeks publicly dismissing as unsuccessful and selfish, was about to be honored as the youngest Superior Court judge in state history at her own wedding reception in front of everyone she had ever wanted to impress. The walk from my table to the stage felt like it lasted an eternity and happened in an instant simultaneously. Every step across that polished ballroom floor was accompanied by the whispered conversations of 200 wedding guests trying to process what they had just heard. Did she say Superior Court Judge? Elena? The quiet one? I thought she just worked at some government office. The youngest ever? That can't be right. I could feel Victoria's eyes burning into me with each step, and when I glanced in her direction, her face had gone completely white. She was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles matched her wedding dress, and Jonathan was leaning toward her with a confused expression, clearly trying to understand what was happening. Judge Kellerman beamed at me as I approached the stage, extending her hand to help me up the small steps. The microphone felt cold and foreign in my palm as she passed it to me, and for a moment, I stood there looking out at the sea of shocked faces, completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. "Thank you, Judge Kellerman," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and amplified through the sound system. I honestly don't know what to say." "Start with the beginning," Judge Kellerman encouraged, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. "Tell them about your journey." I took a deep breath and looked out at my family, scattered across different tables throughout the ballroom. Dad was staring at me with his mouth literally hanging open. Mom had her hand pressed to her chest as if she was having trouble breathing. Aunt Rebecca was frantically whispering to Uncle Frank, probably trying to piece together how this could possibly be true. For those of you who don't know me well, I'm Elena Castellano, Victoria's sister, I began, and a few people chuckled nervously at the obvious introduction. For the past 3 years, I've been attending Hamilton University Law School, where I completed my degree last month with highest honors. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was audible. I could see relatives exchanging glances, clearly trying to reconcile this information with whatever they thought they knew about my life. Last week, I passed the state bar examination, I continued, my voice growing stronger as I found my rhythm. And this morning, Governor Harrison officially appointed me to serve as Superior Court Judge for Millbrook County. The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain, as if people weren't sure whether congratulations were appropriate given the obvious shock on the bride's face. Victoria hadn't moved from her frozen position, but I could see her chest rising and falling rapidly, as if she was hyperventilating. I know this comes as a surprise to many of you, I said, looking directly at Victoria for the first time since taking the microphone. The appointment process required complete confidentiality, which meant I couldn't share this news with anyone, including my family, until it was officially announced. That's when Victoria finally found her voice. "This is impossible," she said, her words carrying clearly across the silent ballroom even without a microphone. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Elena works at some filing job downtown. She lives in a studio apartment and can't even afford to help with wedding expenses. She can't be a judge." The silence that followed Victoria's outburst was excruciating. Every person in that room was now witnessing what had clearly been a private family conflict, and the expressions on people's faces ranged from embarrassment to fascination to horror. "Victoria," I said gently, still holding the microphone, "I understand this is shocking news." "Shocking?" Victoria's voice was rising now, all pretense of wedding day composure abandoned. "It's not shocking, Elena, it's impossible. You're lying. This is some kind of elaborate joke, or revenge for our fight about the catering money, or something, but it's not real." Judge Kellerman stepped forward, taking the microphone back from me with a professional smoothness that suggested she had dealt with courtroom disruptions before. "I can assure everyone that this appointment is completely authentic," she said firmly. "Elena's selection was based on her exceptional academic record, her groundbreaking research in constitutional law, and her unwavering commitment to justice and public service. Governor Harrison personally reviewed her qualifications and was tremendously impressed by her capabilities." "But she's nobody," Victoria practically shrieked, completely losing control now. "She's always been nobody. She doesn't have connections. She doesn't have influence. She doesn't have anything that would qualify her for something like this." The gasps from the wedding guests were audible now. Jonathan was trying to pull Victoria back into her seat, his face flushed with embarrassment at his new wife's public breakdown. But Victoria was beyond caring about appearances. "This is my wedding day," she continued, her voice cracking with emotion. "This is supposed to be about me. Elena has spent her entire life being jealous of me, and now she's trying to steal my moment with some ridiculous lie about being a judge." "Victoria, please," Mom finally found her voice from across the room. "Sit down, honey. People are staring." "Let them stare," Victoria shot back. "Let them see what Elena is really like, manipulative and attention-seeking, and willing to ruin her own sister's wedding just to feel important for once in her pathetic life." The cruelty in her words cut through me like a physical blow, but something strange happened in that moment. Instead of the familiar shame and hurt that Victoria's attacks usually triggered, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Victoria," I said, taking the microphone back from Judge Kellerman. My voice was steady now, with none of the uncertainty that had characterized our relationship for so many years. "I never intended for this announcement to overshadow your special day. Judge Kellerman suggested making it here because she thought you and our family would want to share in this moment." I looked out at the assembled guests, many of whom were still processing the dramatic shift in family dynamics they had just witnessed. "The truth is, I've spent my entire life working quietly toward goals that many people thought were beyond my reach," I continued. "I've been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed by people who thought they knew what I was capable of. But I never stopped believing in myself, even when others didn't believe in me." Victoria was still standing beside her table, but her furious energy had given way to something that looked almost like defeat. The realization that her public attack on me had only made her look worse was beginning to dawn on her face. "I'm proud of what I've accomplished," I said, looking directly at her, "and I'm sorry that my success feels threatening to you. That was never my intention." Jonathan finally succeeded in pulling Victoria back into her chair, where she sat staring at me with an expression of shocked bewilderment, as if she was seeing me for the first time. The applause that followed was genuine this time, led by Judge Kellerman and gradually spreading throughout the ballroom as the guests processed what they had just witnessed. But even as people clapped and offered congratulations, I could see the wheels turning in their minds, reevaluating everything they thought they knew about the Castellano family dynamics. Victoria's perfect wedding day had just become the day she learned that her loser sister was actually one of the most accomplished people in the room. The aftermath of Victoria's public breakdown unfolded like a slow-motion disaster that continued long after the wedding guests had finished their awkward applause, and Judge Kellerman had gracefully transitioned the reception back to its scheduled programming. While the band attempted to restore some semblance of celebration with upbeat music, small clusters of guests huddled together in intense conversations, their voices low but their gestures animated as they processed what they had just witnessed. The elegant ballroom, which had been designed as the perfect backdrop for Victoria's fairy tale moment, now felt charged with an entirely different kind of energy. Jonathan's family was among the first to begin making their excuses. I watched from across the room as Patricia Whitmore, Jonathan's mother, approached Victoria with the kind of rigid smile that wealthy people had perfected for uncomfortable social situations. "Victoria, darling," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby tables to overhear, "what an eventful evening. I think Robert and I are going to head home early. Thank you for a memorable celebration." The word memorable was delivered with surgical precision, making it clear that the Whitmore family would indeed remember this wedding, but not for the reasons Victoria had hoped. As Patricia walked away, I saw her lean toward her husband and whisper something that made him glance back at Victoria with an expression that could only be described as concern mixed with disappointment. These were people who valued discretion and social grace above almost everything else, and Victoria's public meltdown had violated every unwritten rule of their social circle. More telling was the reaction of Victoria's own friends and extended family. The bridesmaids who had spent the day fussing over her and posting admiring photos on social media were now exchanging uncomfortable glances and checking their phones, probably trying to figure out how to explain this turn of events to their own social networks. Cousin Daniel, who had offered to help me financially just weeks earlier when he thought I was struggling, approached me near the bar with a mixture of amazement and embarrassment. "Elena, I owe you an apology," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "We all do, when Victoria was telling everyone about your situation. I had no idea you were dealing with something this significant. A superior court judge? That's incredible." "Thank you, Daniel," I replied. I understand why everyone was confused. The confidentiality requirements made it impossible to explain what was really happening. "But Victoria made it sound like you were barely getting by, like you couldn't even help with basic wedding expenses," he continued, his voice dropping lower as he glanced toward the head table where Victoria sat slumped in her chair. "Now I'm wondering what else we got wrong about this whole situation." This was exactly the kind of reevaluation I had expected. Family members who had been sympathetic to Victoria's narrative about my selfishness were now questioning everything they thought they knew about our conflict. The story of the struggling sister who wouldn't help with wedding expenses had been completely reframed by the revelation that the struggling sister was actually on the verge of historic professional achievement. My parents' reaction was perhaps the most complex and painful to witness. Dad approached me about an hour after the announcement, his face showing a mixture of pride, confusion, and what looked like guilt. "Elena, sweetheart," he said, pulling me aside near the terrace doors where we could speak more privately, "I don't understand how this happened without us knowing. A judicial appointment? That's extraordinary." "I couldn't tell you, Dad," I explained. "The governor's office required complete confidentiality throughout the entire process. I wanted to share the news, but I couldn't risk compromising the appointment." He nodded slowly, but I could see him working through the implications of what this meant about our family's understanding of my life and capabilities. "When Victoria was telling us about your disagreement about the wedding expenses," he said carefully, "we assumed you were going through financial difficulties. We thought maybe you were struggling to find your footing after law school." "I was never struggling, Dad. Victoria asked me for $15,000 that I didn't have because I'm a recent graduate, not because I'm unsuccessful. There's a difference." The weight of this distinction seemed to hit him all at once. "Oh, Elena, I think we really misunderstood what was happening." Mom's approach was more emotional and more complicated. She found me later in the evening, after many of the guests had left and the celebration had wound down to just immediate family and a few close friends. Her eyes were red and I could tell she had been crying. "I failed you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "I failed you, as a mother, and I don't know how to make that right." "Mom, you didn't fail me." "Yes, I did," she interrupted. "For weeks I watched Victoria paint you as selfish and unhelpful, and I believed her. I pressured you to keep the peace and sacrifice your position to make her happy, without ever asking for your side of the story. I assumed the worst about my own daughter's character." She paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue that looked like it had seen considerable use throughout the evening. "When you were growing up, I always worried about you," she continued. "You were so quiet, so serious, so different from Victoria. I thought maybe you needed protection, or special attention, or help finding your way. But you didn't need any of those things. You were finding your own way just fine, and I was too focused on Victoria's drama to notice." The conversation with Mom was cathartic in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in my life, she was seeing me clearly, without the filter of comparison to Victoria or assumptions about what I needed or wanted. Meanwhile, Victoria herself had retreated into a kind of shocked silence that was more unsettling than her earlier outburst. Jonathan had managed to coax her into going through the motions of the traditional wedding activities, cutting the cake, having their first dance, tossing the bouquet, but her heart was clearly no longer in it. During the bouquet toss, which I strategically avoided by retreating to the ladies' room, I overheard a conversation between two of Victoria's college friends that perfectly captured how dramatically the evening's revelation had shifted perceptions. "I can't believe Victoria's been complaining about Elena for months," one of them said. "All that stuff about her sister being irresponsible and selfish, and it turns out Elena is about to become a judge? It makes you wonder what else Victoria got wrong," the other replied. "I mean, if she was that far off about her own sister's life, what does that say about her judgment in general?" The social consequences for Victoria were becoming apparent in real time. The narrative she had constructed about herself as the successful sister, and me as the family disappointment, had been so thoroughly demolished that people were beginning to question her credibility on other matters as well. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the one that Victoria herself seemed to be grappling with as the evening drew to a close. As I prepared to leave the reception, I saw her sitting alone at the head table, still in her beautiful wedding dress but looking more defeated than I had ever seen her. For just a moment, our eyes met across the room, and I saw something in her expression that I hadn't seen since we were children: genuine vulnerability, stripped of all performance and pretense. The sister who had spent years defining herself in opposition to me, the successful one, the popular one, the one who didn't need to work as hard for recognition, had just learned that her entire understanding of our relative positions in the world had been built on false assumptions. Justice had been served, but it came in a form that none of us had expected, and its implications would reshape our family dynamic for years to come. 6 months later, I sat in my judicial chambers on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, reviewing case files for the next day's docket. The leather-bound chair behind my mahogany desk still felt surreal sometimes, as did the brass nameplate that read, "The Honorable Elena Castellano," and the framed law degree and judicial commission that hung on the wall behind me. The transition from law school graduate to superior court judge had been intense, but extraordinarily fulfilling. Every day brought new challenges that required me to apply not just legal knowledge but the wisdom and fairness that Judge Kellerman had always insisted were the most important qualities for anyone serving on the bench. My relationship with my family had undergone its own transformation, though the healing process had been gradual and sometimes painful. The immediate aftermath of Victoria's wedding had created a period of awkward silence that lasted several weeks, with everyone seemingly unsure how to navigate the new reality of our family dynamic. Dad had been the first to reach out, calling me 2 weeks after the wedding to congratulate me officially and to ask if I would be willing to have dinner with him and Mom. That conversation, held at a quiet restaurant far from Cedarbrook's social scene, had been one of the most honest discussions we'd ever had as a family. "Elena, we need to talk about what happened," Dad had said, his voice heavy with regret. "Not just at the wedding, but over the years. I think we failed you in ways we're only beginning to understand." Mom had nodded, her eyes filling with tears that seemed to come easily these days when the subject of our family came up. "We got so caught up in Victoria's drama, her needs, her crises, that we stopped paying attention to what you were actually accomplishing. We treated your achievements like they were expected, while treating her struggles like they were emergencies that required all our attention." "I never needed the attention," I had replied. "I just needed you to believe in what I was capable of." "We should have known," Dad said. "We should have seen how extraordinary you were becoming. Instead, we let Victoria's version of events color our perception of who you were and what you needed from us." The conversation had been cathartic, but it had also made clear how much work remained to be done in rebuilding trust and understanding within our family. Victoria herself had been the most complicated relationship to navigate in the months following her wedding. The honeymoon period, both literal and metaphorical, had been brief. Jonathan's family's reaction to her public breakdown had created a strain in her marriage that became apparent within weeks of their return from Italy. The first real conversation Victoria and I had after the wedding came in October, when she called me unexpectedly on a Thursday evening. I had been working late in my chambers, preparing for a complex custody case, when my personal phone rang. "Elena?" Victoria's voice was smaller than I'd heard it since we were children. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" We met at a coffee shop in a neighboring town, neutral territory where we were unlikely to run into anyone from Cedarbrook who might have opinions about our family situation. Victoria looked different. Still beautiful, but without the performative perfection that had always characterized her appearance. Her makeup was simpler, her clothes more casual, her entire demeanor less theatrical. "I've been thinking about what happened at the wedding," she said, stirring her latte with unnecessary focus. "About what I said, how I acted. I was horrible to you, Elena, in front of everyone." "You were shocked," I replied carefully. "I understand that the announcement was unexpected." "It wasn't just shock," Victoria said, looking up at me with eyes that seemed genuinely remorseful. "It was fear, panic. My entire sense of who I was in our family, who I was in the world, was built on the idea that I was the successful one and you were not. When that got turned upside down so publicly, I didn't know how to process it." She paused, taking a sip of her coffee before continuing. But that's not an excuse for what I said. Calling you nobody, saying you were jealous and manipulative, that was cruel and unfair, and it said more about my own insecurities than it did about you. This conversation marked the beginning of a slow, tentative reconciliation between us. Victoria's marriage to Jonathan had indeed suffered as a result of the wedding incident, with his family maintaining a polite but distant relationship that made it clear they viewed her as somewhat unstable and socially unreliable. More significantly, Victoria had begun therapy to address what she was finally recognizing as a lifelong pattern of defining herself in opposition to others rather than developing her own authentic identity. The work was difficult and sometimes painful, but it was also leading to insights that were changing how she understood our relationship and her own behavior. "I spent so much energy trying to prove I was better than you," she told me, during one of our monthly coffee meetings that had become a new tradition. "But I never spent any time figuring out who I actually was when I wasn't competing with someone else." My judicial career had flourished beyond my most optimistic expectations. The cases that came before my court ranged from routine civil disputes to complex constitutional questions, and I found myself drawing not just on my legal education, but on the years of careful observation and quiet analysis that had shaped my approach to understanding people and situations. Judge Kellerman, who had become both a mentor and a close friend, often remarked that my experience of being underestimated had made me particularly sensitive to ensuring that all parties in my courtroom were heard and treated with dignity, regardless of their background or social position. "You understand what it feels like to be dismissed," she said during one of our regular lunch meetings. "That empathy makes you a better judge than someone who has never had to fight to be taken seriously." The professional recognition that followed my appointment had been gratifying but not surprising. Legal scholars had begun citing my written opinions, and I had been invited to speak at conferences about judicial reform and constitutional interpretation. The work that had begun as my law school thesis was now influencing policy discussions at the state level. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been in how I understood my own worth and potential. For years, I had allowed other people's perceptions, particularly my family's, to influence how I saw myself and my capabilities. The judicial appointment had not just been a professional achievement. It had been a vindication of my own belief in what I could accomplish when I trusted my instincts and refused to be limited by others' expectations. As I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point, I realized that the moment at Victoria's wedding when she called me nobody had actually been a gift, though I couldn't have seen it that way at the time. It had forced me to articulate, both to myself and to everyone watching, exactly who I was and what I had achieved through my own determination and hard work. Family relationships are among the most complex challenges we navigate in life, shaped by years of shared history, unspoken expectations, and often unconscious biases about who we think we are in relation to each other. Sometimes it takes a dramatic moment of truth, a public revelation that forces everyone to confront reality, to break through the narratives we've constructed about ourselves and the people we love. If you've ever been the underestimated person in your family, or if you've ever had to choose between keeping peace and standing in your truth, I hope my story reminds you that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to become who you're meant to be, even when, especially when, it surprises everyone who thought they knew you. The gavel on my desk serves as a daily reminder that justice isn't just about the law, it's about having the courage to insist on truth, even when that truth challenges everything people believe about who has value and who deserves respect. Thank you for joining me on this journey from being called a loser at my sister's wedding to finding my voice and my purpose as a judge. Remember, the people who underestimate you often reveal more about their own limitations than yours. Never let anyone else's narrow vision define what you're capable of achieving. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.